Hello everyone and welcome back to ASP.NET Core 1.0. My name is Steve Bishop, and in this video we're going to talk about HTTP action verbs. So we're just going to take a quick step back away from models for a second to talk about these action verbs because they have big implications to how our controllers do something called model binding. So some of you may have already heard of action verbs, but for the rest of you, it's really a special set of HTTP words that typically indicate which CRUD action should take place. And CRUD is an acronym which stands for Create, Read, Update, and Delete. And creating, reading, updating, and deleting are the four typical actions that you would want to perform on any sort of data. You may want to create a record, you may want to read a record, you may want to update a record, and you may want to delete a record, and that's where CRUD comes from. Now, CRUD is not an action verb itself. It's just an acronym to help you remember what are the four different actions on data that you need to code for. The action verbs that I'm going to talk about here, it's not a complete list, but it's the most common set of verbs that you'll find that correspond to CRUD. Those would be get, post, put, and delete. Now you'll probably notice that put and delete have an asterisk next to them, and this indicates that put and delete are used primarily with web APIs and not with web applications. Typically, when it comes to web applications, that is websites and web pages that you're building, you typically only use the get and post actions. And put and delete are very rarely used with websites. However, that doesn't mean that you can't use them. And I would almost argue that it would be a good idea to get into the habit and get into the practice of using put and delete for updating and deleting your data. That's really a personal choice. The get and post actions are really the only two that you really need or really will find used most frequently to communicate with your web application of the different CRUD action that you want to do. But that changes significantly when you talk about web APIs. Then the action verbs become very important, and you'll see a lot of use of the put and delete action verbs. So I'm really kind of getting ahead of things here. I'm talking about web API before I really even finish the MVC applications section. But trust me, it's really important that you learn this stuff early on because it will start to make a lot more sense as you go when you start to encounter how you're transmitting this data back and forth from your web pages back to your controller and how we utilize this thing called model binding, which again we'll talk about in the next video. So the get action verb is used most often to request an existing resource. This is the read of the CRUD acronym. You want to read, you want to collect or take a look at an existing resource or set of resources. Now the data of a GET request is passed in via the URL of the request, and that means the user can see it right up in the address bar. You'll typically see this as like a query string, or even with the MVC architecture, like we were doing the ID parameter, and we were able to pass in a number to the ID parameter. Well, that number as part of the URL means that we're including that data, that ID that we want to display in our view, was being passed in via the URL GET request. Next up, there is the post action verb. And post is most often used to create a new resource. Now that's more or less for web APIs where it's used to create new resources. In web application development, it's very common for the post action to do a lot more than just creating a new resource. It's typically also when you want to update a resource. But when you're talking about web APIs, that actually goes down to the put action, which we'll talk about next. So the post action, again, is used most often to create a new resource, and it actually passes in data as part of the body of the request. And the advantage of using a post action is that since it doesn't put the data up in the URL, the user is typically blind to the communication that your web page is having with the website or with the web application. so the user doesn't see the data that you're transmitting back and forth. It's not hidden per se, it's just that it's not as easily accessible. So again, get and post action verbs are the two most common verbs you'll see used when you're developing an MVC application, or really any website. You'll see get and post used very, very often. Put and delete are typically reserved strictly for web APIs, but it's not necessary. You can use all four of these action verbs in your MVC web applications. And I would almost argue that it's probably a good practice to go ahead and use put and delete for those updating and deleting CRUD actions whenever you run into them, even in MVC applications. There's been a marriage of web APIs to the MVC web application implementation. So there's really no distinction made anymore between MVC and web APIs as far as how the code is set up with the code base of ASP.NET Core. As such, we might as well take advantage of this in all aspects of our application, and we should use all four of the CRUD actions. But again, that's probably just my biased opinion. So let's move on to the put action verb. Put is used most often to edit a resource. So that's where we want to update, right? That's the update part of CRUD. So we want to change data that already exists. And this is most typically passed in via the body of the request. So you're going to do a put request, and you're going to pass in the data of that request via the body, similarly to how it gets passed in through a post request. Then finally, the delete. And delete is most often used to delete a resource. That's kind of a no-brainer, obviously. So that would be the D in CRUD. And the delete action verb typically has data passed in via the URL of the request, and almost exclusively delete is going to have just like the primary key passed in is the data. Because you're going to delete a single resource, you need to pass in a unique identifier in order to know which resource you want to delete. So typically that data that gets passed in via the URL is the ID or primary key of that resource you want to delete. So now that you've had a quick little primer on action verbs and you've seen the four basic action verbs that get used in web APIs as well as MVC applications, let me show you some important pieces of information to know about the controllers and the actions on your controllers, because this will directly impact the way that your web pages communicate back to your web application. So let's hop into Visual Studio and take a look. So I cleaned up our home controller a little bit. I got rid of all those commented out pieces of code. And here on our index action, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add an attribute to it. And I'm going to use HTTP get. Okay? And this means that the get action verb must be used in order to access this index method. I'm going to go ahead and save this. And let's go ahead and build. Actually, we're going to debug, start without debugging. So with my web application up and running, I'm going to go to Fiddler here because this just makes things a little easier to work with and demonstrate to you. I'm going to go to my Composer tab, and I'm just going to put the URL, and I'm even just going to make sure that it's real explicit here. I'm going to do home index. And you'll notice that there's this drop down here of get, post, put, and there's head, trace, delete, search, connect, and a whole bunch of other different actions that you could use. I'm just going to select get, which is a typical get request, and we'll go ahead and execute this. So we see that we got a 200 response. I can open this up by just going to the web view, and we'll see that we get the hello there, Steve Bishop, your ID is 1. You work for the company. Now, if I go back to the Composer and I change this from a get request to a post request, and try to execute this again, you'll see that we get a 404 error. So this indicates that using the post action on my request is actually going to cause the Visual Studio or excuse me, the web application to not be able to find this index action because I have put this attribute tag of HTTP GET. Now, if I change this from HTTP GET to HTTP POST, and then we try this again, so we have it set to post, do an execute, and we get a 200 result. And I can once again open this up and take a look. We can even look at the raw data here, or the text view, and see that we get exactly the response that we expect. We can do the same thing for put and delete. We just have to do HTTP put to use the put. So we'll change that again to put and execute, and we'll see 200 should come up, and we can once again take a look at the response. So we are seeing that there is this extra little parameter of sorts that our request is sending to the web application, and our application is able to kind of filter and identify. You have to have the appropriate action verb used in order to access this index method. Now, if I take HTTP put off and we leave the attribute off and we try once again doing the put, let's take a look and see what happens. You'll notice that we get another 200 response. So when we remove the attribute, that helps us to really get any sort of response. It doesn't really matter. We're not filtering based upon the action verb. So these action verbs are just a handy way of filtering your requests to make sure that you're getting the exact type of request that should be going to that particular method or that particular action. Because if you have a delete action, perhaps you want to make sure that the request also has this delete action verb before you're going to allow someone to go ahead and delete it. It's just kind of a little extra insurance that, yes, this really is the action that I want to take. So that's going to wrap it up for action verbs in this video, and we're going to move on to model binding here in the next video.